Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a look at the two new EEs for the characters that have already been announced to have balance patch adjustments. Of course, this is a smaller size patch, or I should say a smaller size balance patch that we're referring to. But without further ado, let's get into it. So as a quick recap, if you recall, what they decided to change for Fenrris is that for his S2 after, or rather, if I'm not mistaken, after using Strike of Fate, after granting or using this ability, he also now increases the combat readiness of the ally in the back row by 50%. Which again, in theory should include himself, but in general is a very interesting concept just because it offers you a decent amount of combat readiness. And ultimately, though he is quite unpopular, it is an interesting concept for a cleave or a more speed oriented or a more, I guess, AoE damage dealing concept, which, to be fair, before we knew about the EE was honestly okay as a concept, as it does feed into kind of the playstyle that he wants to, abide by. But ultimately, Fenrris is a very unpopular character. He's a Covenant character, and in a lot of cases, because of the way that the game works currently, things like counterattacking or things like combat readiness pushes are a bit more complicated to deal with because of characters like Harsetti. That said, in my initial review of Fenris's buff, I think that it was very interesting just because not only does it, again, still kind of lean into his playstyle, we were also announced that he was going to be receiving an EE. Now, before we get into that EE, I do also want to say that, again, with what they did for new kid Aiden's buff, who is the other character that also received a change from the balance patch, she also looked pretty okay. They did kind of just feed into the whole, hey, you know what? I think the Aiden characters just have to all have the same mechanic of countering or having evasion built into their kit, which, honestly, it is what it is. It does kind of feel like nowadays, if you want to survive in epicseven, you do have to have some sort of either immortality or some sort of 100% evasion built in. Whatever the case is, I was still very hesitant about saying or about new kid Aiden herself as well. I do think, again, her having a bit more control in her kit and not just being forced to AoE every single time, and having, again, a bit more agency and a bit more control in her kit through her S1 and deciding how she wants to deal her damage is very impactful. But let's now actually break down the kits and the exclusive equipments that have been added. Let's start with Fenrris. First and foremost, the 14% attack is fine, great for Fenrris. However, as you're seeing right now, there are actually 3 effects with them basically, I guess, releasing an unprecedented kind of EE. So first, let's start with the more typical versions of the EE. First, you have a soaring arrow affecting EE, which is EE effect, which is that it dispels 1 additional debuff from all allies when using soaring arrow. Fine. Okay, decent, honestly, considering that a lot of people, will take some characters like Abyssal Euphine or some debuffers and sometimes punish you when you're trying to deal damage in a cleave heavy or damage dealing team composition. This is extremely, extremely common, especially right now if you're someone that's been using characters like Litika. Part of the reason why Litika is so powerful is because she has things like Bind and Restrict in her kit. And thus, that's why she's so popular, especially when dealing with a lot of these counter-heavy characters. However, the next one that we have is Strike of Fate, which, again, is just a flat outright damage increase to that ability specifically. Honestly, fine. But then we have the unwavering skill effect, which is now that when you are facing specifically Harsetti as an enemy, it grants Will of Purification and only applies to PvP. But what this effect does is that it increases the combat, or rather the fighting spirit gained by 100%, and at the start of the first battle increases combat readiness by 50%. Now, obviously, the reason why this is so impactful is because, well, any character that is able to receive combat readiness at the start of the turn and I guess, affect their own turn ordering is very powerful against Harsetti, just because, especially with characters like Zio and now with Fenrris, being able to guarantee that you take a turn, and with, again, artifacts like Young Senya's artifact that allows you to kind of, in a sense, manipulate the turn ordering, this is obviously a more effective answer to Harsetti. Now, in addition to this, it also reads that it is unaffected by effects that reduce combat readiness, increases of the caster, and it remains even after he revives. Now, let me be clear. This idea for a concept of an EE is creative. There's no getting around it. It is creative and it is different compared to a lot of the other things or the other EEs that we've received in the past. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the EE is without controversy, as even if we skip down real quick to the comment section, this is a very divisive and controversial EE. Number one, because, well, they're making an EE to counter one specific unit who honestly is very oppressive. If you take a look at things like Arena, if you take a look at things like Guild War, it is just objectively true that Harsetti is, for lack of a better word, disgustingly present in all content. Now, regardless of how you feel about the character, it is, once again, objectively true that Harsetti does warp the game in a very, very serious manner, with some players having 2 sets of units, and with other players being honestly pretty frustrated with what you have access to in terms of countering her. In this case, or with what people are saying, people have said this is disgusting, making an EE unpopular on an unpopular failed unit. Though debatably pretty true that Fenrris isn't played, just to counter one of the most egregious units. Once again, units released is just an admission of failure as game designers, and failure at balancing the game. You already made a unit just to counter Harsetti, Young Senya, who I agree is supposed to be our hard counter. And if you wanted to balance her, you just had to stop the RNG turn order bullcrap. This is just shameless and dirty, and I hope it's a delayed April's Fool's joke. Now, again, this is a bit egregious, and though the second comment kind of falls in suit with the whole idea of them releasing a problem just for them to release a solution to it, there are still people that think it's honestly an interesting kind of EE, which again, I am more on the side of, though I am very aware and very also personally annoyed at how Harsetti works. Make no mistake, I am also someone that has felt the pain of having to deal with Harsetti, and I built 2 units for that exact reason. That said, ultimately, it does feel like this concept for an EE, like, regardless of the bad precedent that it sends, is interesting. Now, I'm curious for how you guys feel in the comment section, as having personalized EEs does not feel amazing, but they are thinking outside of the box with this EE, which is why I think it's very interesting. Now, in terms of the actual EE effect, if they don't change or remove or affect it, I do think that honestly having this combat readiness change is quite amazing, to be honest. Now, again, for who exactly you'd have to use to prepare or to make this work, there's a chance that with Fenrris, you essentially, I guess, end up using maybe some combination of Zio, or use some combination of Young Senya, and you kind of manipulate the turn order so that you have Fenrris take his turn. However, in terms of how Fenrris will be able to get off this unwavering will effect, I think even for right now, I'm not sure if even if this counters Harsetti, if the supporting cast of Harsetti will even get countered by unwavering will. So in that sense, again, I think we'll have to wait and see to see exactly what people end up using against Harsetti. As for me right now, I'm trying to imagine who you would pick with, I guess, with the Harsetti to kind of deal with this. Maybe you would take someone like New Moon Luna and kind of manipulate things in that sense, maybe with a Ludwig or some combination of that. My only concern is that, again, because of the way that Harsetti works, and you can't really guarantee turn ordering, it really does come down to, I guess, basically who the opener is, or who you can, or how you end up using someone like Zio to make Unwavering Will work. But at the end of it all, I do think that regardless if Unwavering Will, this specific EE, is not super bad or negative or game changing or even necessarily solves Harsetti, there is some discussion that needs to be had, and definitely some concern that players need to have about making a specific character based EE, because again, we haven't had this in the past. And for what it's worth, if what they're going to do is essentially release an unpopular character and just basically band-aid their kit by making one of the most overpowered or like strongest characters in the meta get like countered by a character that most people don't want to pull for, well, it sets a bad precedent, as now you basically have to pull for not just the limited characters in an effort to not get set behind, but also now you have to pull for the unpopular characters in case if they get a ridiculous or crazy looking EE that is specific for dealing with a character that they've honestly not done very well in addressing or releasing good counters to. Sorry, that's kind of just the truth in terms of Harsetti, regardless if Young Senya is a good answer to her. As a side note, by the way, though a lot of you, or though some of you may say that Harsetti is solved, just use Young Senya, a lot of the Harsetti teams are also being paired with Young Senya, so it's not even as solved as you think it is. But ultimately, Harsetti, especially in Guild War, is quite prevalent and quite annoying. And though, again, you guys can argue that Harsetti is always a character that will be around, this is a very controversial EE to begin with. Now, finally, I want to talk about the EE for Aiden, and hers is, well, a 12% crit chance EE, and that's fine. However, in terms of her EE effects, the first is that she now absorbs some of the damage dealt when using an opening. The second is that with her ability known as You Started This, with its effect, it increases the combat readiness that she gains by an additional 5%, which is fine, honestly. But the third is that it increases the damage of Scattering Petals, Falling Leaves by 10%. Now, honestly, in terms of how she now works, I do think that guaranteeing this as a heal, or being guaranteed a heal on her S1, effectively just makes her like Savior Aiden, like a Savior Aiden look-alike, basically. But now she has the injury built into her kit. In terms of that, I do think that people will likely use this first EE or this third EE as the actual EEs that she wants to fixate on, just because the combat readiness of her going from 20 to 25% is not nearly as insane as it sounds, at least from what I understand. Now, for what it's worth, I do think that the combat readiness concept is cool. However, as I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with her other version with Savior Aiden, the combat readiness cheesing, or the combat readiness effect, was most valuable when trying to trap or punish a Zio, and you were able to cut or force a Zio to hit into you, and because you had 70% evasion, you took that gamble and they pushed you forward, and you were then able to use Savior Aiden's S3. However, because of the kit that new kid Aiden has, even if she is granted a bit more combat readiness push, this S3 is not quite the same, as it is simply just a damage dealing ability and doesn't quite have the same trapping effect. And in addition to this, for what it's worth, she also is not granted an attack buff, or well, there's a very good chance that you aren't going to use something like MLDB on her. If you do end up using it and you're trying to effectively take the same or assume the same role as Savior Aiden and being able to one-shot something or counter something when you hit her, well, why aren't you just using Savior Aiden, as she has better multipliers and a better, more tuned kit for that specifically? As a result, in terms of EEs, I think that people are likely going to use her S3 one if they're trying to use her as a dedicated injury character, or otherwise her S1, just so that she has some sort of sustain and heal in her kit without having to be on the injury set, or rather on the lifesteal set. Finally, I do want to say that this new EE, if I'm not mistaken, is the equivalent to the Espa collab EE. If I'm not mistaken, it's just like a crit rate and like crit damage stacking EE, which is, or not EE, artifact, which is pretty cool. But that's essentially all that we've seen, guys. Just overall though, in terms of my thoughts, again, I'm not super sold on Fenris's EE, although it does look quite concerning in terms of where it could lead in the future. I'm not even exactly sure what exactly will be paired with this specifically. However, having character specific EEs to address, again, more unfavorable or more despised characters in the game is definitely a direction, and although I think that at some point Smilegate themselves have to admit that either a character needs a nerf or that they need to really hunker down and make some sort of free answer to Harsetti to kind of reduce her effectiveness, this direction, I'm not sure if this is quite it. In any case though, guys, honestly, the new kid Aiden kit just effectively makes her a clone of Savior Aiden, or it feels like at least she's a clone of Savior Aiden that just does injury. And Fenris, he looks interesting, and alongside his buff, maybe he is more powerful, and maybe people end up, I don't know, using something like Litica alongside this. But again, I'm a little bit confused about, again, how he's going to be able to use his unwavering will passive more effectively, and otherwise his other EE effects are honestly kind of mid. Anyway, so guys, that's going to be it for today's patch. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys on the next one. What's going on, Smilegate? Anyways, thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.